Well, hello, and welcome back to the final day of Design Thinking Virtual Experience. I'm your host, Michael Dieger. Now, as we do each day, we'd like to start our day with a moment of calm reflection. Today in particular, we want to take a moment of silence in reflection of the events of 9/11 and to remember those we've lost. Since 2017, we've been thrilled to convene folks from so many different organizational functions to evangelize what design thinking and a human-centered mindset can do to transform workflows and experiences from customers to employees alike. We survey our design and innovation global community to learn more about which organizational functions are actively using design thinking. It was amazing to see how design thinking is used across our community. Just a few stats. Over 20% of HR departments are using design thinking. Over 25% of marketing departments are leveraging human-centered design. 25% of IT departments are rethinking infrastructure with a human-first approach. 10% of sales teams are investigating design thinking as a sales tool. Now, just as the original theme of Design Thinking Austin back in April implied, the design thinking mindset is moving rapidly, far and beyond design teams and the design function. It's being evangelized and trained as a tool to be better. As a community, we're deputized to make a human-centered mindset stick across our organizations. You must make design thinking part of all processes, not just something that's isolated with select projects with select teams. Everything must start by looking through the lens of the user. This has to be built into everything you do by first creating a foundation in your organization by which design thinking can flourish. And the task ahead of us is a lofty one. Even with all these departments and functions across the organization that are recognizing the importance of implementing design thinking, there's much work to be done. 56% of our survey respondents say that their organization's competency level of the design thinking mindset is still at a beginner level. Moreover, many organizations are using design thinking in pockets, but the organization hasn't made a public commitment to the mindset at large. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, we're excited to release our very first market study produced by Design and Innovation Global. Some of the stats I just shared are from that report. To learn more about the findings from our global community, check out the free market study at designinnovationglobal.com. Now, it's time for our last morning meeting. We like to keep you organized and informed here at DTVX. I can see your OCD through the webcam right now, actually. Now, here's a quick rundown of what's ahead of us today. To kick us off, Mariah Garrett, USAA's Chief Design Officer, on reverting chaos into opportunity. She'll be followed by George White, the Chief Innovation Officer at Cantina Consulting, on how to leverage both design thinking and innovation practice to build an organization that's flexible, creative, and innovative. Next, we break for today's iteration of the Design Drive in our virtual expo hall. Make sure to poke around all of our Design Drive participants and earn points for a chance to win one of our great prizes. Today's the last chance to compete, get in the top of our leaderboard, and win. Now, back to today. After the Design Drive are think tanks. Think tanks are smaller interactive group discussions. There are 10 topics today for you to choose from with limited capacity in each, so make sure to reserve your spots now. After think tanks, we'll take a quick break and regroup for 2 closing keynotes before we transition to our prize drawings and close out the show. By now, you know what that sound means. DTVX is giving away tons of prizes to our engaged attendees at the end of the event today. I'll give you a quick recap of the prizes. First is our Social Butterfly Prize. Are you ready to fly around our virtual expo hall and learn about how sponsors can help you? Well, then you'll be in the running for a $250 gift card. Requesting information from sponsors can also earn you big points. Next, the Top Networker. The attendee with the most one-to-one meetings, that's right, you can connect one-to-one on DTVX, will earn the title of Top Networker. Besides Uber bragging rights, it also comes with a $250 gift card. And then the grand prize. The attendee at the top of the leaderboard by the end of the event will have the opportunity to donate their $1,000 grand prize to a charity of their choice. Oh, and the leaderboard top 5. Attendees who make the top 5 on the leaderboard will receive prizes. You still have time to win. Now, if you'd like more info, feel free to click on the Game tab on the navigation bar. Moreover, if you need any assistance during the event, our team is here to help. Click on the Get Help button on the top right corner of the platform and get direct access to attendee resources, our how-to video, and connect with the DTVX team. While you're there, connect with us across our social channels using hashtag DesignThinkingVX. We want you to post your pics, experiences, and all the fun you're getting up to here at DTVX. Now, we know that design thinking never occurs in a perfect scenario. It's either driven based on necessity, to change, or a fear of being disrupted, like a phoenix from the ashes. Our first keynote today shares how USAA is reverting chaos into opportunity.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Mariah Garrett, and I'm the Chief Design Officer at USAA. I've been working at USAA for 4 years now. And for anybody who doesn't know us, we're a banking and insurance company, also for consumer-based. And we also have life insurance and health insurance. We have about 14 million members and about 30 to 40,000 employees. And we serve the military community. Special thanks to Michael for that moment of silence around 9/11 today. But about 50% of our members these days have no direct military affiliation, so they inherited or married into their membership. And I think that that's interesting because we have to effort very hard to still pay attention to our young enlisted. And so despite the fact that 50% are just general population, we still see specialization as a way to carve our niche. And so we pay a lot of attention to that young enlisted population, and it's close to my heart because these people are living paycheck to paycheck, and we have a very diverse community of our membership. So that's something we give a lot of energy to. And of course, that goes with human-centered design, right? The humans. And so my team is about 250 full-time designers, almost 300 with contractors. And we are a centralized organization that then matrixes to the lines of business to support all of their initiatives, as well as hold our core, kind of our design enablement and design ops function that we think about, where we manufacture our design language system, hold our best practices and methods, et cetera. And so all of those 300 designers are evangelists of those practices, but we also kind of have the centralized group to help create them and coach on that. All right, so that gives you a little bit of framing for my world and the context that I'm coming to this conversation around. So let's go ahead and jump into a bit of a presentation and hopefully have some dialogue. So we're all in the business of risk. You may not be in it as directly as I am. Maybe you don't work in financial services. You're not dealing with the same regulatory environment or material risks that I am. But we all have operational risk inherent in our day-to-day practices. And frankly, we all have existential risk. And when you look at the reason that design thinking exists and why so many companies are attracted to it, that existential risk is one of the primary motivators. The average lifespan of a US company on the S&P 500 has fallen by 80% and has gone from 67 years to 15 years. These are pimply young companies that will not live to survive the next day if they're not continuously innovating and continuously improving their experiences for their customers. And as USAA will be a 100-year-old company next year, we're kind of on the edge of that statistic, but we're not immune to it. And so as a company that is very lucky to have industry benchmark NPS and OSAT scores, the thing I appreciate is that we are not resting on our laurels, and we acknowledge this existential risk, the strategic risk that we're all working to mitigate on a day-to-day basis. And so I think back to John's talk yesterday, and one of his quotes was that design thinking is high risk, high reward. That's really appropriate. Yet, how do we normalize the behavior of design thinking and human-centered design and human-centered practices in a company where not everything can be high risk, high reward, where there's an environment of risk mitigation and risk aversion? Well, you have to normalize it. You have to take away the mystique, and you have to stop using it just for special edge cases, just for the innovation projects. You have to start using it everywhere. So I want to talk a little bit about how we have tried to do that. And one of the quotes that I love here is this idea of everyone designing. One of the best ways to try and do this is to stop being quite so sacred about it. And that doesn't mean that craft doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that our discipline and the years of practice that we've built up don't matter as designers. But if you want design thinking and human-centered practices to have impact within your company, the whole goal is to democratize it. One of the things I like to say is that design thinking doesn't eliminate the need for hardcore design, but what it does is it acts as an API. And we know from a technology perspective what an API does. It opens up the capabilities underneath. It doesn't devalue it. And so if you start to think of this as everyone has the ability to design, to create actions, create environments in which that right actions can happen, you can change your way that you're framing design within your organization and make it more accessible to everyone. So that's our goal, to make it more accessible to everyone, to take away some of the glamour that we like to associate with design. And one of the ways we've done that is through breaking it down to its most root level. And there's a lot that goes into being human-centered. There's a lot of methodologies. We've all got our practices. We're really geek out on the methods. But if you can get down to these three basic keys that we repeat over and over and over again is, are we really using data and empathy to uncover the real needs of people, right? Not just acting out of assumptions, not just acting out of history, not just acting out of, where business requirements tend to come from, which are kind of just our brains and our guts. And then Two, are we creating, testing, and iterating our ideas at the lowest possible fidelity? For many large corporations, we've all moved towards agile, and that's great, and we're able to drive efficiency out of that. But why are you developing anything at all if you can learn it a Post-it note, if you can learn it a sketch, if you can learn it a no-code prototype? You should be testing and iterating at every single one of those phases until you cannot learn anymore at that phase. And then more than anything, you're empowering diverse teams to align and decide together, because no single discipline can accomplish the work that we have to do by themselves. And so that's our goal, to bring these human-centered principles to life on a regular basis. And we obviously do that through research and engaging our members. But for far too long, the fine arts and industrial design roots of design has relied on discipline genius. And so how can you unlock what has historically been a skill set of the few and make it a skill set of the many? It will get watered down, and you're going to have to deal with that. So a big part of that is making it reusable, publishing your methods, making these things really approachable, and starting to write down your recipes. Discipline Genius and acknowledges that there are ways that we've learned to do things over time, but to unlock those, you've got to break them down to their root elements and really get to those motivations. What's the value proposition of any given methodology or exercise, and how are you bringing it to life? So that happens through research processes, and we invite our members to be part of the design process. Of course, members are our customers. That's just our term for it. But we also invite our business partners to be part of this process and to generatively as well as evaluatively test and iterate on the things that we're making on a day-to-day basis. And so this is one way that you start to unlock. And you're not just going through the motions, you're building understanding and relationships through these exercises. Relationships with your consumers that you can call back and ask for additional input and guidance, but also relationships with your business partners. And I can't tell you how many times I've brought somebody into the field, be it physically or virtually, and that aha moment of touching someone that has been an abstract persona for them changes the way that they interact on a day-to-day basis, changes the way that they think about their business problems. And so we also do this through these published methodologies that are available to everyone to truly democratize our ideas. And so we've got this library of methodologies that's available internally within our company, and we say how easy they are. We provide templates. We've got mural boards for everything, and we provide coaching services alongside these. Many times these exercises are executed primarily by our design teams, but often many times where we can't support a particular business initiative or it isn't funded yet, these will be executed directly by business partners and product managers, and we welcome that. Yeah, I think we can't protect our processes anymore and expect to have the level of penetration that we really want. And so this comes in the form of coaching. We do training for our business partners. And yes, it means that they're doing design thinking, complete with, business folks drawing stick figures and storyboarding. And it is both fun and hard. It is really hard for them to get out of their day-to-day operations to come out into this other way of thinking. And so one touch point is never enough. One immersive exercise is never enough. One boot camp is not going to do it. You need to set up these long tail, repeatable processes, multiple check-ins, and have the designers there to support them afterwards. And so anytime that our human-centered design team, we actually have a team that just focuses on evangelizing these practices, interacts with some business partners, they're also doing the matchmaking of what's your closest design team and how can you rely on them in the future. But oftentimes we can get siloed in one aspect of our practice. And so one of the things that I've seen and observed over the last 4 years can be an impediment, and I've seen this at many clients when I was in consulting years before. can be an impediment is this belief that designers don't have the full view. And you're right, we don't. And so how do we don't not just teach our methodologies to others within the organization, but intentionally open our aperture? And so this is a prompt that I've given to my teams multiple times, and we talk about regularly, of an experience 360. And because we have dedicated, persistent teams that are staying with an experience for a very long time, right? We've got a team that's dedicated to credit card, and a team that's dedicated to checking, and a team that's dedicated to loans, and a team that's dedicated to auto insurance, and so on and so forth. These teams are building this knowledge over time. You're never going to understand it all. And the challenge is really to assess where are the gaps in my knowledge that are creating risk, and what is the fastest way to learn how to close those gaps. And so I'll take a minute and walk you through this circle, because all too often we tend to over-index on one aspect of it. There's the traditional design aspect of it, usability best practices, our platform standards for web or iOS or Android, etc. The heuristic analysis that we tend to do on our own experiences, on our competitors, and of course the brand guidance that we all hold dear and have to infuse into our work every single day through our design language systems and other aspects. And there's the humans, right? The customers. And for us, those are both our members, and when we're designing internal employee experiences, our employees. And we, of course, designers often reach into this bucket using qualitative research and qualitative insights. For my particular team, we own that qualitative research aspect of things. We also have quantitative research, something that makes some designers a little bit more itchy, and we don't know how to execute all of that survey work and many of the things that it takes to get quantitative information. Feedback and ratings and things that product managers and digital product owners have historically owned, or consumer experience folks. And then more and more these days, behavior and sentiment. And you see many more companies mining their interactions with their customers to be able to understand both the actual customer behavior within their platforms, as well as the sentiment data from chat and phone conversations and many other things. And so how are you mixing these elements together to build your stew of your understanding of what people really need? All too often, we've just focused on that first line. And we cannot discount the business and the technical constraints and requirements, from stakeholder inputs to business processes, what's really going on under the covers, and the technical capabilities. This came to life for us a couple years ago when we were dealing with bill pay, and we were redesigning the bill pay experience, and that was fantastic, and it was going to be a great digital experience. But guess what? The data was being stored inefficiently on the back end, and too many of the checks were being processed as paper, and those checks were going out slower than we wanted them to. And so unless we were willing to address the business processes and apply design thinking to the business processes that were actually getting those checks out the door, and how the data was being stored and how that affected our members, we weren't actually going to create a delightful experience. And so we did. Right? We applied it end to end using a service design methodology, not just an experience or product design methodology. And then moreover, market. We've historically left some of this to strategists or marketing departments. And yes, they belong in the conversation, but how are you building your personal understanding, regardless of your role, of the competitive landscape? How are you bringing in analogous experiences and looking outside of just that initial competitive set? This is one of the easiest levers to pull when you're looking for inspiration in design thinking and ideation. And then how are you looking at market trends and disruptors? Oftentimes, I see large corporations that are living in fear of disruptors and not necessarily deconstructing their experience in the same way that they deconstruct their own. So this is something that we pull upon many times when we're saying, are we being diverse enough, not just in our teams, but diverse enough in our inputs? And so here's a little tool to gut check that. All right, here is the dirty secret of design thinking. Great ideas are the easy part. And all too often, I feel like we stop the design thinking process at that moment of ideation. We say, okay, I've got all the human inputs, I sketched a cool concept, ta-da, and now we hand that off to detailed designers, or we hand that off to developers, or we say product management, go, deliver this all the way to market. But we all know that the real challenge lies in the operationalization of our ideas, in keeping the human-centered thread all the way through, so that when MVP actually gets to market, that V doesn't just stand for viable, it includes valuable to the person you initially created the idea for. And so how are you bringing human-centered design and human-centered practices to all the steps in the process? And that ties all the way down to the details and accessibility, and how you're designing your front-end development practices and instituting your design language system and building out that componentry. And so if you are in an organization where design thinking is something you just do up front, check yourself. And talk about how you can reiterate these practices over and over and over again, from your team retrospectives into your agile processes, and so on and so forth. Creation that changes a product, and definitely creation that changes a company, requires deep collaboration. And one of the realizations that we had within our organization is that people were mistaking interdiscipline collaboration for intra-discipline collaboration. So the designers were talking to the designers, the developers were talking to the developers, the business people were talking to the business people. And so how are you setting up your team such that I don't care about your org structure? Your org structure can be any which way, but how are you setting up your team dynamics such that you're bringing those diverse perspectives together and creating a pod that can really care for and advocate the human-centered needs throughout the entire process? This is one of the things that we've worked on really hard. And I almost think of it as a beautiful invasive species. And our goal is to create these many touch points of interaction, many touch points of infection almost, and then to grow those over time, such that design thinking becomes invasive and becomes something that everyone takes for granted. This is not easy, and it takes much more persistence than you would imagine it would. I go back to the old marketing rule of 7, right? If it takes 7 impressions for a brand to stick, imagine how many impressions it takes to build comprehension around complex methodologies and why we value a certain way of doing something. It's a lot more. One of the other secrets, other than just straight persistence and grit, is never wasting a good crisis. And this goes back to that theme of 180s. I'll give you a use case. So we had an experience in our credit card space where we had identified a bunch of risk and some issues that we needed to mitigate. Nothing that was affecting the security of our membership. It really was about everybody being able to access the right things on all the channels that they wanted. And so initially, these things were being managed as separate line items, and they were being managed as separate initiatives. And what we came to find out when we leveraged our relationships and were able to dig into the actual findings, we said, well, actually, this could be one experience. And we recreated a credit card hub experience that was dual facing, worked for both our member service reps and our members to address a bunch of these credit card issues so that people could engage with us on their channel of choice, whether that was web, whether that was member service rep, whether that was mobile, and have their interaction where they needed it to exist. This created efficiency. It was a major win for the business. But it also was an example of pausing long enough to not just take the work that was coming off the pipeline, but to really say, here is how we're going to rethink about our problems in a new and human-centered way. Humans think about their credit card, and they want to take remediated action on many different things at the same time. If I've lost it, maybe it's likely that I have fraud. If I have fraud, maybe it's likely that I need to contest a transaction, and so on and so forth. So how can we drive that experience at one time? And it sounds like a tiny, obvious thing, but it was revolutionary to our business partners in the card space and became a proof point that we could lean upon for that portion of the business to say, hey, remember when we paused and did this? And that didn't take a lot of time, and it had a lot of reward. And so look for those moments where you can leverage crisis to create reward. Another great example has been work from home. If you told our IT organization last year in December that they had to get all 30,000 employees working from home, they would have laughed at us, said, I need a decade and $10 million. And yet, by the beginning of March, all of the USAA employee base was working from home. And we've moved on our tooling faster than ever before. And one of the ways we've done it is integrating design thinking into that process. Yes, doing the tech heavy lifting, but also understanding that people are having different kinds of problems, and we need to go and talk to our employees and understand their needs in this new environment. And so design jumped on the bandwagon, and we created all of our human-centered design programs in 100% digital offering and transferred that in-person workshop experience to a digital experience within just a matter of a month. We created a facilitation growth program. And one of the things that we've identified is that facilitation is the superpower of designers. We all come from that background where we like to put on our headphones and make something and go heads down. But facilitation is a secret superpower for how you can create actual change. And so how are we training our employees in that and growing our next generation of facilitators, not just leaving it to our design directors and our design producers? And then all of our tools and methodology, we created additional digital coaching. And we were the first organization. We happen to use Mural, lots of different good collaboration tools out there, but we happen to use Mural at USAA. And we were the first team to have Mural at USAA. So when that tool opened up to everybody in March, which was a huge business decision, we had an opportunity to step outside of our own work and coach other people, business partners, tech partners, on how to use this tool to think creatively and to collaborate. And so we did that. It wasn't part of our core work. It was definitely an inject, but it was a worth it inject because it invited us into additional conversations than what we were already in. And then facilitation services for non-design topics. So we offered ourselves up as digital facilitators. And guess what? All those non-design topics quickly become design topics. And so being human-centered and having a service mindset in terms of how we approached our work, rather than saying, I'm overwhelmed, I've got enough, this is my plate, is one way that we leverage this crisis to create deeper penetration and to help grow that positive invasion of design thinking at USAA. We even launched an additional Collab from Home challenge. So this was a specialized 5-week program that was structured outside of any individual program that all of our partners could sign up for to figure out how to collaborate from home. We have a pretty highly distributed design team at USAA, and so we already had some muscle around this, but you have thousands of people, especially in our tech and business partners, who were used to going into our gigantic office in San Antonio or a large campus in Plano or Phoenix or some of our other locations, and didn't have the muscle to move to work from home. And so how can we support, not just through the traditional HR approach, but how can we support these employees by helping them grow their collaboration skill set? That was one of the things that we really lent into. So I don't want you to hear any of this and take away from the making of design. Making is still the only path to true alignment. This has come to life for me so much this year. We're in the middle of moving to an entirely new CMS program, content management system, and reimagining all of our USAA.com, as well as our next generation mobile app. And we have some huge programs that are coming to fruition right now. And while you keep it in the realm of words, if you keep it in the realm of Post-it notes, if you keep it in the realm of briefs, everyone is picturing their own thing in their head. And so this is the next generation of unlocking and democratizing design and design thinking. Is how are you using the toolkits that you have, whether they be Sketch or Figma, a strong design language system, or components that you publish to other places, to help people imagine their way forward. And that doesn't mean that you don't need the expertise of design to make the final screens, to bring accessibility to life, which is so critical. There are no edge cases anymore, and these people that we're designing for have unique needs that we all have to pay attention to. But creation is something that demystifies the process more than anything else. So if you find yourself sticking for too long in the abstract, processing that value statement until it's super shiny, push through to the next phase. Time box, it is your friend. And make something that is solid, make something that is tangible, prototype it in the highest fidelity possible. I know that sounds a little scary sometimes, but prototype it in the highest fidelity possible, because you may not have the alignment that you think you do. And so the craft of design is more relevant than ever. We just have to continuously open up our craft to a larger community over and over and over again. And this starts with the design thinking aspect of it, but extends into other aspects of our craft, from front-end development, reaching deeper into dynamic design, to looking at computational design and how data plays a role. So come back to those keys to human-centered design. Use data and empathy to uncover the real needs of people. Create, test, and iterate at the lowest possible fidelity, and then up that fidelity as quickly as possible to make sure that the alignment is true. Empower diverse teams to align and decide together by making together. And that can be hard. It is much easier as a group to critique than it is to create. And so you will need bursts of both. But when you critique something that has been made together, you're going to have a leg up on the buy-in ladder like it's nobody's business. The last thing I'll leave you with, and this is something I presented to this team before, is these 5 questions. And so if you are not a designer, obviously a lot of the advice that I gave today resonates probably pretty deeply for people who have a similar background and discipline to me. But if you're not a designer, but you are a leader, and we're all leaders in this, within your organization, here's 5 questions that you can ask to provoke and say, are we really hitting on those 3 keys? What's the team's shared understanding of the value we will deliver? All too often, I see developers or architects left out of this value conversation. All too often, this value conversation ends up too one-sided. Have you talked to real people you're creating a solution for? It sounds so basic, but I can't tell you how often it isn't happening across many corporations and organizations. And so there is no right exact prescription. Sometimes it's generative, sometimes it's evaluative, but talk to real people and do it in as large numbers as you can accomplish within a reasonable time frame. But also know when you have reached the extent of how much you can know. There is such a thing as too much research, and it's when the diminishing return starts to go down. How many solutions did you consider before deciding on one? I can't tell you how many people come to their first idea and they're like, we did it, it's amazing. This Post-it note is the best thing since sliced bread. If you didn't kill some of your darlings, you're probably not there yet. Have you pivoted from the feedback you received? Many people hear but do not listen when they receive feedback from stakeholders or your customers. And so how have you actually changed something? You should have a story of change for every single feature that you release to market, a story of learning. And then what's the riskiest assumptions your team is making about what people think, feel, and do? This is my absolute favorite. You are always making some assumptions. But how can you assess the riskiest ones? How do you know what you don't know? How have you laid out your unknowns and said, what do we need to attack the most furiously? Because you might think it's about data. You might think it's about how this API is going to operate, but it could actually be about, will people even actually use this? Is this the way people want to engage with us for a feature such as this? And so if you haven't answered that question, then you may not have the alignment that you think you do, or you may be aligned on the wrong problem. So lastly, I'll say that some of my lessons from this year: continuously design your integration. Integration as an organization and as a function is the hardest work we have to do. And so how are you applying design thinking to your own process and your own organization? We changed many things this year and the 4 years prior, and we've learned a lot along the way. And I can't tell you how many times that follow through has mattered, that pivot has mattered. As someone who was a consultant and left many shiny decks on a shelf and knew that my business partners were not going to be able to execute on them, being able to pivot along the way is the most valuable thing to being in-house. So use it if you are. Have an open book service mentality. If you find yourself guarding any bit of your process, check yourself. And acknowledge how you are servicing others. It will break down walls. Leverage both your carrot, which is that service mentality, and your stick. We have real controls in place that measure the use of our design language system. We have real controls in place that say if you don't go through these reviews, you cannot release to market. It is part of our software development lifecycle. And so if you do not have design thinking or the controls for design thinking baked into your process, and it's only a nice to have, guess what? Many times it will not happen. So think about your stick and use it wisely. Make to align over and over and over again. Make, critique together. And then model that critique. Many times people do not know how to respond to design, or they are not critiquing in a way that is cohesive with the root value that you intended to create. They're just giving a subjective opinion. So ground everyone in the feedback that you need, and then model that critique in front of your business partners, in front of your technical partners, in front of all of your partners, to make a safe space for that critique to happen. So those are some of my top lessons from this year. They've probably always existed, but they resonated a little bit extra for me. I want to thank everybody who is part of the Design Thinking event, Michael and the whole team, for making this possible. I've enjoyed some of the talks that I've been able to participate in, and I really appreciate this community and learning from each other. I hope that you took something away from this. I'll go and make sure that I check the chat after this and get any questions that y'all have. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Mariah. Organization-wide change is extremely challenging, but to realign an organization's vision during times of turmoil and decline requires even more commitment and dedication. Up next, we'll hear from George White, the Chief Innovation Officer at Cantina. Over to you, George.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I hope that you'll find the next half an hour or so with me to be interesting. My name is George White, and I am the Chief Innovation Officer for Cantina. I'll give you a little bit of background on who I am and who we are, and then I will talk a little bit about design thinking and design versus innovation practice, how the two sort of are separate and unique, but also how they overlap and how we can make them work a little better together. As I said, I work for a company called Cantina. We are based in Boston, and we do a lot of everything. If you look at it, we are doing research, strategy, design, development, consulting, engineering. But we lump all of that under the rubric or the envelope of being an innovation firm. And we have a very strong bent towards technology-based solutions. We have started ourselves when we started over a decade ago. We were really an engineering business, but we've grown, and now what we do is really about everything from the early stage of our problem space all the way through to the solution space. And what that's meant is that we've done work that covers a wide gamut of things, everything from creating virtual reality systems for head injury detection, to connected dog collars, to designing the experience and content for an innovation center that had a public-facing storefront, to thinking about how to do better educational systems and design for improving student experience overall. So really broad range of things. To put sort of my job in context, it's kind of hard to explain what I do day to day. What is a chief innovation officer and what's the role? Frankly, when I got this job several years ago, I didn't know, and I don't think anybody else did either. My job description was kind of left up to me to figure out. I know that's not true everywhere, but it's definitely been true for me. So after thinking about it for a long time and really trying to decide what it was that I did, I kind of focused on the idea that it's about making progress. And what that means is that there are problems out there in the world. There are people who need help with making solutions, and my job is to help them get to the outcomes that they want to have. So in some ways, as I'll talk about a little bit later, what I do is very much like the purpose of design, but it's also about thinking about how we actually figure out how to apply the new to what needs to happen to solve our problems. All right, so let's get into this a little bit. Actually, before I do, let me just say one thing. So the next half an hour or so is me talking. I'm not going to do any slides today. I really thought about this a lot, and actually, when we first came up with this concept for this talk, way back in the end of 2019, I really thought that having a lot of slides would be great. It's really interesting to kind of show some of the things we're doing. But one of the things that's changed, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of the things that's changed is that we're now all in a situation where there's less human contact, and we're all forced to deal with all these digital systems that are intermediating our communications constantly. They're between us right now, in fact. And so I thought it might be nice to just have some FaceTime with you to talk about some of these concepts, and hopefully, we'll have a chance to chat after or during this conversation. So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the new context that we're in, because I think this is actually really important to setting the stage for the world that we're talking about. These days, if you think about it, we're dealing with a whole range of challenges that we didn't have even just a few months ago. And a lot of the assumptions and a lot of the foundation and bedrock for how we assumed business and life should operate have kind of been disrupted. And that's obviously not in small part due to the fact that we're living inside of a global pandemic, and that the response to that pandemic has been varied and difficult, and often has been the decision between two choices or three or four choices that are not ideal. But I think it's fair to say that with all of that change and all of that pressure that we're now feeling, that it's actually put a deep premium on things like innovation and design. A common thing that you'll hear when you talk to folks, especially in the innovation space these days, is the idea that things have accelerated a lot in the last several months. So if you think about the idea of having a plan or having an idea for something that might have taken, you be projecting out to do next 5 years or next 6 or 7 years, all of a sudden those things are becoming, do them this year, do them immediately. And with that pressure, that need to respond to change and the need to respond to the disruption that we're feeling, comes a deep, deep premium on design and on innovation practice. So, here we are talking about this new state. A lot of people call it the new normal. I actually don't like to think of it as a new normal. I think of it as the new context, which is to say that, yes, we are adjusting to new sets of situations that didn't exist, But we're also actually in a place where we're dealing with the fact that the changes that we know that we can adjust to today may not be the changes we have to deal with tomorrow. And you can see this in things like education, for instance. Right now, as a very of-the-moment thing, many of you probably have children who are going back to school or going to college. And I can guarantee that if your family is like mine, you probably didn't know a week ago or maybe 2 weeks ago exactly what that experience would be like. And so when we think about that kind of thing happening, we have to think about, well, how do we respond? How do we actually create the right kinds of experiences, maybe bring in new possibilities to address the problems that we're facing? And that's what design and innovation are all about. So I want to start with a couple of personal definitions of things. So first off, I'd like to say that I think that design is, and innovation to some extent too, are fundamental aspects of human behavior. Scott Berkun, in his recent book, How Design Makes the World, talked a lot about this, about the idea that design is something that every human being does. It's something that is always present. And sometimes those are not well-designed things, but they're constant, right? And there could be about little tiny things like, well, how do you put together this meal? They can be very big things like, how do you build this government or this business? Or it could be something, anything, really, frankly, in between. And so when I think about it, I think of design as a universal exercise. It's something that everyone participates in. When I think of innovation, it's a little bit different. I tend to think about innovation, broadly speaking, as a specific practice. It's something that happens all the time and has been happening throughout human history. You can go back to the very first human tool, which was a rock. It's about 2 million years old. There's an example of one of those sitting in the British Museum. And you can see that someone took this rock and they crafted it in some way. They took the tools that were at hand, which is to say rocks and sticks and maybe fire or animal hides, and they combined them to make new things. They broke those rocks and made axes out of them. And they eventually tied sticks to the rocks to make better axes. They improved their ability to start fires or carry fires. They improved their ability to clothe themselves. All those were basically pulling in things from the environment or from their minds and combining them to make new things. And innovation is that practice. Innovation is the process of pulling all these things together and finding new solutions to what might be age-old problems. So I think that those are two very broad definitions of design. So one other thing I want to quickly touch on before I get more into design versus innovation, which is I want to talk a little bit actually about innovating versus invention. I think it's really important to note when I talk about innovation that invention is a separate topic. Right. So if you think about this broadly, the idea that let's take Lego as an example, right? So you've got a box of Legos in front of you, and they're all the standard bricks, 2x2s, 3x4s, whatever, doesn't really matter. And you can combine them and compose them to make something out of them. When you come up with something new that you're making out of those Lego bricks, you're innovating, especially if you're doing it in the context of a specific problem, like putting Lego bricks together to make a model of a home or something along those lines. On the other hand, when a new Lego brick comes out, somebody invented it, right? It comes in a different shape in new ways. And what's really interesting about that is when that Lego brick appears, that it gives you new possibilities for what you might innovate, right? So Lego at one point was largely just plastic bricks. Actually, I think before that was wooden bricks, but largely plastic bricks. And people were able to come up with lots of interesting solutions. Later on, Lego added pieces that were clear, transparent, had different angles and shapes. And eventually they added components that moved on their own and were able to do things like create robots. Point is, all of that stuff was invented on top of this existing system of Lego, and it opens up new possibilities for innovation. So now you can make a Lego sorting machine or a Rubik's Cube solver or a drink server with something that used to be just plastic blocks. So innovation really increases the space or uses the increased space, and invention increases the space by which we can innovate in. Similarly, I think that you can apply that same thing to design, right? So if we think about technology capabilities, for instance, we're able to think about the idea of design as being able to grow as we've learned new things, right? So I'll use a really old example, but the printing press, right? The printing press was an ability for us to actually take a new technology, apply it to something that had been done, handwriting books or hand illustrating books, and then going into the idea of creating consistent books, right? Reusable over and over again. what's really interesting from a design perspective is that started to open up questions about like what the typeface was going to be, and what was readability supposed to be when these machines were producing these things. And so now we can get the nitty gritty of exactly how we can create the best possible thing to fill the shape of our need. And I think that's actually a real key thing about when we think about the differentiation between design and innovation. I'm going to give a couple of definitions, and just for the sake of argument, you might disagree with these definitions, and actually I kind of hope that you do. The problem, of course, is that both these terms are heavily overloaded, and so I want to simplify. I want to come back to something that really focuses down on the basics of what I think these things are. Again, you're free to disagree, but hopefully we can have a conversation about that. Design is the process of shaping a thing to achieve a desired outcome or outcomes. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I want to contrast that with innovating, which is the process of identifying and applying a thing to a novel specific context. And so let me talk about that for just a second, because I said a lot of different things in there that might be a little bit confusing. A thing, first off, what do we mean by a thing? Well, a thing can be anything. It could be an artifact. It can be a process. It could be a service. It could be any number of tools that we use to address a problem at hand. And when we're talking about design, we're usually talking about how to make that specific tool better. So think about a hammer, for instance. Hammers, we're going to abstract this down to just generic hammers, not ball peen hammers versus claw hammers or any that kind of thing, but just the idea of hammers in general. A hammer, generally speaking, is a tool for, let's say, putting nails into material. Now, there's a lot of design decisions you can make about a hammer, right? You can decide that the grip needs to be different. You can decide that the length of the lever, the arm, needs to be higher. You can design the weight of it. You can design the surface that contacts the nail, or the opposite side surface, like in the case of a claw hammer, where you can pull nails out. You can get into all the specifics of those things, and design really is the focus of the properties of the thing that allow it to do its job. Now, some of those properties are required properties. Hammers typically need a certain amount of weight, right, to be able to do their job. Sometimes heavy if it's really something you need to either break or impact strongly. Other times it's lightweight. But they also have aesthetic aspects, which are not truly just look and feel, but how the thing is experienced, right? So the grip on the hammer, and how the material works, and how it feels in your hand, and what it tells you about what you're going to do in making a strike, and all those things. That's really important. Innovation, by contrast, tends to look a lot at the question of, okay, great. Well, do I need a hammer at all, right? Or do I need a different kind of hammer? What is the focus of the thing I'm trying to solve, which may be getting a nail into the wall, or getting something hung up, or something else. And so innovation might come with something where at one point you may have used a slightly different version. You might use a jackhammer, a handheld hammer, or a mallet to break something, and later on you get an air piston jackhammer. Or you might get explosives, or you might get any number of other possible solutions. But the idea is that basically innovation looks at a genericized problem, a problem that might be as simple as, I need to get from A to B as fast as possible, not die and carry some stuff. And through time, technology and all those other things, eventually the answers to that can change. The way that you can express what's going to happen can change. Now, certainly the design of the thing can change, and it often does. But innovation, generally speaking, focuses on that broader question of, how do I find a new and novel, or when do I need to find a new and novel answer to a problem? And design worries more about what is the shape of the thing once I've found it. Now, I will say that, again, you're free to argue these things, and the distinction is, frankly, somewhat arbitrary and is muddied these days. It's entirely possible to look at design and many of the activities of design, and look at innovation and many of the activities of innovation as a fairly tight Venn diagram, where they have a lot of overlap. So, for instance, research is key to both. Problem formation, understanding that you're focusing on outcomes, being human-centered. These are all things that they both share. But in some ways, if we're going to make a distinction, and I think it's sometimes useful to make a distinction between these two, we can look at the idea that, again, it's about this idea of where do I go and find answers to how do I solve a problem, versus how do I improve the solution of that problem. So, all right, so we've talked a little bit about definitions and innovation versus design and how I see them. What I'd like to talk a little bit about now is the thought of how do we actually think about these from a business perspective. And this actually should lead to, I think, to one of our first problems that we often see in meshing these two things together, which is that we tend to, from a business function perspective, put them in different buckets, right? So it's not uncommon, for instance, to have a design team in a business and an innovation team in a business, and sometimes multiples of both. And they tend to work in sequences. They tend to come from, well, the innovation team is going to go off and they're going to explore new ideas and try and come up with new concepts. And the design team is going to focus on making our product better or doing customer research that really tells us how to improve the things we're doing. And we tend to think of them as separate activities. Truth is that in many ways, they do interlock. They do actually have a shared sequencing. And sometimes they come back and forth. So I'm going to go back to my hammer, right? So I mentioned the idea that you might be trying to figure out something new for the grip of that hammer. Well, when you start to think about, say, the problem space that you're in, and you find that when you do research, for instance, you talk to your users and you find that the hammer slips out of people's hands a lot, then you might start thinking about how you can use new materials to improve that. And sometimes you'll have those materials at hand and you can make choices and you can be generative about that design. And that is truly design. Other times, you may realize that you don't have anything in your stable right now that can be applied to this problem. Now, there are two possibilities, and this is where that invention versus innovation thing becomes slightly important. One is you could say, okay, great. I know that I need to solve this problem. I need to start doing some research to understand what materials are available. I need to understand what's going on in the world. I need to understand people's grip strengths and all these other things. And then you can start to look through a catalog. You basically create a query and then search against all the things that you know to find an answer to your innovation need. Sometimes you'll find, though, that the answer doesn't exist, and that's where invention comes in. That's where you have to start thinking about the idea that maybe you need to create something totally new, completely new, and by expanding the center of human knowledge outward to be able to solve this problem. But many times, innovation focuses on the idea that there's probably an adjacent solution. There's probably a solution someplace out in space that you can use to tie this back. At the same time, both of these things will interlock in terms of things like the overlapping needs around understanding the problem space. So, for instance, one of the things that we do a lot is UX research, right? Where we're sitting there with our customer and with their customer and trying to understand needs deeply. Well, to do innovation, you got to do the same thing. You have to understand someone's needs very deeply. You have to understand what the problem space is, because you're going to create a query or you're going to create a hypothesis in both cases about what it is that you're trying to solve and what you're trying to do. And so the tools that we use sometimes in both cases, user interviews or design charrettes or surveys, tend to overlap. And so there's some confusion sometimes between those two. And when you have confusion like that, sometimes it leads to territoriality. Well, we're going to do the user research, and we're going to do the mock-ups and the prototypes. And sometimes it leads to a thing, hopefully, if you're doing it right, where you have a nice overlap, where people start to see that you can create these cross functionalities between these two things. So anyway, that's one of our first problems, is sort of the sequencing and interlocking and how they interlock. Another problem that both of these areas deal with, but in slightly different ways, is human-centeredness, right? So it's undoubted when you're doing design, especially when you're in the phase of design where you're trying to figure out exactly how the solution matches up tightly with a current user need, where you need to do iteration and you need to be keeping the person or people that you're designing for in mind all the time. So for instance, if you were designing a new solution for someone in a wheelchair to be able to get into a building, you need to understand their needs. You need to understand their capabilities and their comfort levels and all these other things. And so you need very specific information. You still need that to some extent when you're doing innovation work, but often you want to actually turn your hypothesis more to broader general questions. And that is to say that you're looking to understand a broader space and not necessarily the exact shape of the solution, but actually where a solution might be found. So I'll give it a short example of that in the technique that we use in innovation called pyramid searches. So imagine that you are in a particular business. Let's say that you are in the business of shipping, and you have forklifts, and those forklifts need to do a certain thing. They need to lift up a box and move it from space to space. One of the things that you can do if you don't have a distinct answer to this is you can start to look for expertise within your space. You can look for someone who can tell you how to answer the problem that you have, and you can try to find a way to work up the chain of expertise that they have. So ask the person you know who's smartest about this problem space. If they don't have a solution, you keep going and up the chain until you find the person who, in your industry, who's penultimate in their knowledge of the space. And if they still don't have an answer, you need to go someplace else. So one way you can do that is you can basically ask them, what's an adjacent business or adjacent type of problem space that you know about that might actually have an answer? So in this case of this shipping and forklift need, you might eventually get to the point where you find that the trucking actually has an answer, and that solution can be adapted to what you're doing. So you don't have to invent a new solution. You may not even have to design something, although this is usually where design kicks in, but you can actually start to apply those things. And so while there are elements of doing that same sort of process of looking for similarities in other solutions that you might apply, design, I think, focuses as much on the specific application and coming down to dealing with how do we actually make this thing work versus how do I find a new way to answer this question that I've got. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is how you build the skill sets for these two things. So I think that generally speaking, there are, again, a lot of overlaps between the two, but they're not always as clear cut. So I think there's some things that are prerequisites for both to succeed well. One is diversity. So when you're doing innovation work, given the construct I talked about before about the idea that it's a search problem that you're trying to query against, having a lot of knowledge and having a lot of different types of expertise can be a key way to improve your odds of doing innovation well. And I think you still need that in design as well. You need to be thinking about your biases. You need to be thinking about what you're doing to empathize and understand the problem space that someone's in. And to do that, it's often best to have people who have a wide range of experience and can raise their hand about the idea that the design that we have here may not necessarily be universal enough because we haven't looked at all points of view. But the skill set that you want to have there is a little bit different. So in the case of innovation work, I think it's really important that you have people who are they're maybe not polymaths exactly, but they're people who can have a really broad generalist viewpoint of the world. And it's not to say you don't want specialists. You want to bring the specialists into anything you're doing because you need that depth. But the people who I find drive innovation teams the best are the ones who have the broadest viewpoint. They probably aren't masters of any particular skill, but they're very, very good at looking at the broader world and at finding interesting new ways to think about applying problems from space A to space B. Designers should have some of that as well, but they typically need a different skill set. They need to be deeper in their skills. So obviously the first example would be tools, right? If you're a designer and you're working in digital tools, you'd better understand those tools really, really well. You have to be able to do things with them that other people can't do. Mere mortals can't do something with, say, Adobe XD that you can do. Another thing I think that's really important for designers in this regard is that they need to be able to think a lot about the specific problem that's in front of them in a way that allows them to carry through and keep that focus as they iterate. So innovation tends not to have as much iteration per se. You still have it, right? You have an idea, you need to prototype, you need to test, you need to figure out what's going on. But a lot of what you're doing there is editing away ideas in their entirety. In design, and just to be clear about that, you still do the same thing in design, but you do that in a much more generative way typically. You're trying to actually create many, many ideas and then synthesize and edit them back down. And again, some of these are, let's say they're hard distinctions to make, but I think those distinctions exist. All right, so skill sets, we've covered that. So I guess the last thing I'd like to talk about is just the notion that these two things actually have more in common than not. When you really look at what has to happen, as I talked about before, there's this notion of an interlocking cycle. There's this notion of these two pieces of things having to come together and figure out what they're actually going to do and how they're going to achieve those goals. And I think it's really, really important that when we think about this, that we bring designers and innovation teams together as much as possible, as early as possible, and throughout the whole process of making a thing as possible. Because what you'll find is that as we do this, as we combine these two disciplines, they will feed off each other, they'll grow. And I think the best example that you can see of this is how both disciplines have gravitated more and more to being human-centered and being more and more focused, in the case of business, on customers and experience. And I think this is really key. I talked earlier about some of the challenges that we face, and I talked about the idea that COVID, for instance, has driven us to a new set of challenges. The truth is, we've been dealing with this for a long time, right? We've been dealing with the notion of experience as a key part of what we do for a couple of decades now, as we've had to focus more and more on the idea of being disrupted or of rapid change, of having to adopt new technologies. We've had to find ways to adapt ourselves and to being able to handle all this change, and also to deal with the fact that it's now very possible, with the commonplace access to technologies and commonplace access to global markets and everything else, that a new competitor might show up at any minute and try and eat your lunch. Both of these processes have attempted to think about and answer the question, well, how do I, as a human being or as a collection of human beings, who frankly are the slowest part of the change model, how do I get better at the key elements of understanding what it is that someone needs, how I can deliver on that need, what the barriers are, and then how can I overcome them? And I think that both design and design thinking, as well as innovation, have been, and the spreading of innovation practice, have been attempts to basically answer those questions of how do we get to designing for the best experience possible. And it's a little bit different, I think, than the way that we used to think about them. If you go back to the beginnings of design, you could make a hard distinction that design was about aesthetics from a surface perspective. And for innovation, we tended to think about things like transformational innovations and big change and come with totally new products. And what we've now seen is that both of these practices are kind of coming together on the idea that there's a pacing of improvement that needs to happen to all the products and services that we have and create, that's intended to give us a better way to think about and absorb all these outside changes while still being responsive and still being humane. So I think, with all that, what I'd say is that there's a lot of commonality between these two. I think there's a lot of places where we can get together and find ways to bring these practices together. But ultimately, I think that we'll find that the differences between the two of them are less so than the ways that we can actually come back together and create a unified view of the two of them. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Hopefully this has been interesting for you, and it's opened up some new ideas. I would love to chat with everyone out there. You can reach me at george@cantina.co or Stone Hippo on Twitter or LinkedIn. And that's STONEHIPPO. And I'd love to talk more, and I'd love to hear more about your personal definitions of the two, what you see as challenges between innovation and design, and how you might have reconciled some of the difficulties between the two of them. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
It's been another packed morning from our super insightful keynotes. Now, we'll be heading over to our virtual expo hall. Don't forget, every activity in the expo hall earns you points, and you can be in the running for one of the awesome prizes we'll be giving out later today. Following the design drive, we have our think tanks. Again, those are small group discussions based on specific topic interests. They're one of our fan favorites and one you won't want to miss. Enjoy, and I'll see you back here at 2:40 p.m. Eastern. Bye for now.